Welcome this morning to Office Hours, and thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Today, our guest, our presenter is Edward Erfurt. Edward is the Director of Community Action for Strong Towns, and he has lots of experience, not only as in training as an architect, but also working for various planning firms and other types of organizations, as well as local and municipal governments. Today, in particular, I want to draw upon Edward's skills and capacity to design places that really work for people. Edward is able to do in a moment with a pencil far more than I could do in a year with a whole host of other resources and supports. And so I want to just open it up. Edward, do you have some thoughts on the general theme? I used a fancy word, a $10 word, of propagating people-oriented places, only because I like the plosives as they come out, or the explosives, I should say, but it is to the idea of how do we get people-oriented designs back into the forefront, really back into the place of prominence that we need when we see so much that really falters on the question of whether this is actually a good human habitat. How do we create, maybe that's a better way, creating great human habitats? And so, Edward, do you have some thoughts on the theme? And then we'll go into our first question together.
Yeah, I do. And this is something that I always try to preface this. So my background is in design and drawing, and it's easy for me to come up with like a solution, right? That's easy for everybody to come up with a solution. And I don't want any of this to be thought as a hard and fast solution. What really, when we're talking about this from a Strong Towns approach, it's a thing about this as a process. So there's some things I want to share today and kind of walk through and try to answer questions. And please feel free anytime during this. If you have a question, feel free to jump in in the comments or raise your hand so we can be a little more interactive on this. But as we go forward, there are ways about thinking about the development patterns that we have today compared to the historic development patterns or traditional development patterns of all of our cities. And we've vastly departed away from thousands of years of planning and thinking about the places that people live. And we've kind of taken this experimental approach over the last 70 years. And with that, there's a lot of things that I come across, and I think we write a lot about at Strong Towns, that we ask you to think about it as a different approach. And through the work that I do, part of this is to try to show you at my thought process, which is a little messy, it's a little crazy on some of the things, but I assure you the thought process that I do, anybody could do. You don't have to be an urban designer, you don't have to be an architect. You're actually better if you're not. You're better if you're a local citizen, because you know more about your place than any consultant coming in. When we think about the human environment, if you take the approach of being human first, how would you utilize the space? Where are the places that you want to be? If that's in your mindset as you walk in the door to have one of these conversations, or when you're reviewing a built or proposed project, and you put people first and you put place first, the result is much different than the development pattern we see in a lot of our cities. And the places you feel uncomfortable and don't want to be in are places that we don't need to repeat. And I assure you, through the process, there's something that has forced that to occur, and we can help show where those pinch points are, so it's not forced. And there's a concept that I always like to put out there as we're going through development applications. And when I've worked in cities, what you want to do is you want to make the good easy. And that's a hard concept for a lot of municipalities to understand, to make the good easy, because everything has to be kept on an equal plane when you talk about government rules and regulations. And unfortunately, we have to go and put a whole lot of rules on to prevent a whole lot of dumb ideas. You know, the person that put the 8-foot fence in the front yard, and everybody said, why you have an 8-foot fence in the front yard? The person that put the billboard on Main Street that didn't seem right. Okay, now we have to make a rule for that. All those rules are just, they're so fine-tuned, the pencil's so sharp, it doesn't allow for a lot of the flexibility we see in traditional towns of being a little chaotic. So as we're talking today, think about process, and I'm sure you all have situations you've come in where you've butted heads against this or found challenges with the built environment or proposed developments. So keep that in mind, and let's talk a little bit about that today.
Yeah, I love that. And the idea of making the good easy. And that's, I think, what really, one of the reasons I like you, Edward, is because of your ability to actually understand not only the process, but also the reality that like people with a regular education need to be able to like work through these things. And that was my experience working in municipal government, is that some of the senior staff were very keen to make sure that, you know, regular things were happening, but then they were being held back by a whole host of policies that they were just too fatigued to deal with. Or you would see like junior staffers that were chomping at the bit. They knew that, you know, their parking regulations or other things were limiting so many opportunities in the city of Surrey where I was working, and yet they were held back by these mechanisms and these forces. And so in your professional work, you had to navigate those things. And I think that a lot of our local advocates want to know, like, how do we advocate for these types of things? And maybe to help understand even what is it in terms of the first question that the Strong Towns approach offers people in communities who want to see their neighborhoods become people-oriented places again. We're not asking for a highway to become a people-oriented place, but surely our town centers, surely our gathering areas, surely our recreational community centers and things like that, they ought to be more people-oriented. And how do we work towards that?
Yeah, so the fundamental principle, the fundamental thought that everybody should take going forward is something that Strong Towns has ingrained in a lot of the work and the writing. And it's best described as the 4-step process for public investment. And when I share this type of idea with municipalities, we're doing this with our community action labs now. Folks are kind of taken aback by it, believe it or not, this very simple 4-step process, because one, it's simple, because it's actually less than 4 steps, but it also can scale up, because when you think about the first question of the 4-step process about humbly observing in your community, humbly observing where people are struggling. A lot of communities, when they look at that, they're like, oh yeah, we have an area, we have a missing sidewalk, or yeah, we have an area where people want to build, but nobody can build there. And you go through that, you know, kind of broad pieces, and all of a sudden it results in a project. And that's really not, this idea is much broader than that. This idea can apply to policies, and it can apply to every aspect in how government runs, because it should be running for us. So the 4-step process, the first step is to humbly observe. And when we talk about humbly observing on those locations, that means we have to kind of get out in the neighborhood. And every department I've worked in municipality, I required folks to get out in the field. Like, I would take them out. I was the guy that they always knew they needed to have an extra pair of boots at their desk, because I would take them out on job sites on a random notice. And there were many, many shoes that were destroyed with my staff because I would trudge them across different places to see. But we've got to go out there and we've got to look at these places and get out of our desk, get away from our keyboards, and sit there a couple of moments and observe. When you're in these places and you see that there is a struggle, the solution to the struggle could be quite vast. So the second step of the process is, what can you do? And we described this in one of our sessions as, what can you do to fix this problem in 24 hours? When we add a constraint like time to this, all of those giant lofty ideas, oh, we're going to rewrite the entire code, oh, we're going to tear down a freeway, those are huge moves. Those are giant leaps that are difficult to get to. But what is the next smallest thing that we can do? What can we do in the next 24 hours to improve this situation? It's not going to solve it all, but it's the first baby step to an increment. And you do it. So the third step is you actually do that item, and then you see what happens. Not every one of these, I'm not going to live in a Pollyanna world. Not every one of these ideas is a winner. Not every one of these ideas is going to solve it or make things better. but the amount of time you've put into it, the amount of investment you put into it is small. So if it wins, it's a huge win, right? Because very little in, huge output. If it fails, very little in, we'll try something else. What can we do in the next 24 hours from that lesson? That's the fundamental process. So when we start to look at these types of, that type of approach, I want to share some of the projects that I know I've written about that I think would be interesting to kind of walk through, because I think the ability for me to draw these things is a little bit easier than the full explanation in a post. And the very first project that I know we all talk about at Strong Towns is Taco John's. And when you go and you Google Taco John's, I found, this is their advertising. And I think everybody expects like, oh yeah, well, how can we make this to be a little bit more human or a little more urban, or a little bit more people oriented? And, a little known fact, I'm an Eagle Scout, so Boy Scouts are kind of a special place in my heart. And the founder of the Boy Scouts of America has this famous quote about leaving this world a little better than you found it. And that quote kind of been manipulated a whole bunch of different ways, but fundamentally, when we go someplace, we should leave it better than when we arrived. And that has a lot of different meanings to it. But when we look at a development like this, can we put this, when we do redevelopment, so we know that the Taco John story is about bulldozing blighted, dilapidated buildings and putting something shiny and new in. No problem with shiny and new, no problem with new development, but the form is not human. Nobody's walking here. If you notice, there's no sidewalk that actually leads to the front door of the building. So even if you did use a sidewalk, you're not actually going to be able to walk to the building. So what can we do to put this back better than we found it? And the question is, what is the next smallest step? And in the Taco John's 2.0 story, I wanted to show that if you just took the building and you just moved it up to the street, what would happen? And yeah, there's a whole lot of different, how does a driveway work? And is this really what this developer would do? I will tell you that yes, drive-throughs will go anywhere on a site. They're ideal sites for it, but I have worked on developments and I have participated in developments that have been built that have drive-throughs like this. So just by moving this to the street, all of a sudden the site becomes way more efficient. So when you take that, it's kind of like, what is the next smallest step once you get over the idea of building to the street? You end up with all this extra land, because if you take all the parking that is now result on the site and you put back exactly what there is currently today, and you just move the pieces around on the site, the next smallest step, you end up with all of this residual land. And a lot of people ask about this building to the street. When you pull buildings up to the public right-of-way, there is this kind of fancy urban design idea that there are public realms and private realms. The public realm is everything that the public has access to. These are streets, these are parks, these are areas that you don't need permission to access. You or I could go to Brainerd today and walk along the sidewalks in Brainerd, and that is public realm that we are available for us to go in. By moving the building to the street, the building now contributes to that public realm. So on the street, there's some math out there and analysis that's been done that whenever there's a missing tooth or missing section on a block, humans, as they've studied and watched them walk up and down streets, when you walk down a street, as soon as you get 80 feet, if you walk 80 feet and there's no buildings and it's against parking lots or vacant lots, 80 feet's too far. And at that point, you don't feel comfortable as a human. There's no edge, and you come back. So anywhere along the street that you can build up to the street on this particular block you don't quite get 80 feet to the corners, but you have something in the middle that, again, by building to the street, you start to frame that space. The other thing with building to the street on a site like this that's critical is we see this in our crash analysis studios where, and I'm sure we have all experienced this. There are streets we drive on every day that we are confident that we can drive faster than the speed limit. And frankly, even if we don't look at the speedometer, we know we're driving faster because of the optics of the street being so wide. So building to the street, bringing buildings to the street, enclose the street space, and generally on these streets, when the buildings are built closer to the street, it encourages and gives cues to the drivers to drive slower. So there's a lot of other aspects to it, but using the building to help slow traffic is another piece to it. And again, it's about the next smallest step on this site. We've got all this extra land. This is a redevelopment site. This site had financial support from the city to get built. It has very poor return. So with all that extra space, what do? Well, you could start adding buildings to it. Now, when I work with developers, that first tier of development, their project is based off of this fast food joint. Taco John's paid for all the redevelopment of this site. It funded all the parking, the stormwater, the water and sewer to it, electrical, all of those pieces that are on this site, fully funded that site. And it penciled out for the developer, so they made profit off of the Taco John's. But they made profit off of something that's a less desirable form that is not maximizing the development potential. When you look at this site, if you just, and you don't need a ruler, you can just see, you could take the Taco John's, and even if you didn't, just by tracing that, you could see that you could get 3 or 4 additional Taco John's on this site. Not that you would put Taco John's in there, but it gives you an idea of perspective of amount of scale where this site could be 3 or 4 times more productive in a 1-story development just by relocating the building. And this is the next smallest step to it. And when I work with developers, when they have a project that only starts with that first building, they don't have any plans for the other stuff. They haven't planned for that. So those can be placeholders because, again, there will be another redevelopment project that will occur. There'll be another interest of development sometime in the life of the city. And now we have a placeholder for those to be built. If Taco John's is successful and people are attracted to it, or if another development adjacent to this is successful and people are attracted to it, the value of this site goes up and the incentive to develop it into a building goes up. And by moving the building to the street, we made it easier to do that. The same idea occurs, and we should be asking ourselves when maintaining the street, can we put it back better than we found it? And we're coming up on orange barrel season. You know, I know all the Department of Transportations, they're getting the snow plows off and they're getting the orange barrels ready and they're getting ready to do their repaving projects. And there is an opportunity when we make that investment for repaving to put it back better than we found it. And I've done this on projects where you can see where you have very wide lanes and the drainage doesn't work and it's time to repave because it's the end of the life. Using the same funds, but in a different configuration, can we make it better? Can we fix the drainage? Can we add sidewalks? Can we slip in on-street parking? These are all things you could do. And in fact, on this street, it didn't cost any more to do the right thing by right-sizing the lanes and adding the sidewalks and getting the drainage to where it needed to be than the project of repaving the entire street and reconstructing where the water was going to go to get to those drains. The value of this in the public realm, by thinking about it differently, you're able to get more out of it. You've maximized the potential within that development. So it's about thinking about that next smallest step. And any of those items, I would really, these are things that as you're looking at sites and you're looking at developments, just by moving the building around on the site, by tracing it, cutting out in construction paper, using trace paper, moving it on the site to maximize the potential is the next smallest thing. And time again, as I've done that kind of parlor trick with folks and I start to show that, if I'm early in the process, there's the initial pushback. Oh my gosh, I never knew this could happen. I've got to redesign my whole site. But it starts a conversation with the folks that are doing the entitlement review and at the city level. It gets the engineers thinking about that differently. Gets the planners thinking about it differently. It gets the development team thinking about it differently. Again, if they can look at this and realize that if moving the building can allow them to double or triple the future development potential for a site, there's an incentive for them to do that. It in turn is an incentive for the municipality to support that because it provides more future productivity for that, the thickening of the neighborhood. So it's a process, and it's a process that I think any of us can do. You don't have to be an urban designer. It's a matter of picking a pencil up or a piece of construction paper and laying it on the site and repositioning things. And that's really powerful in the public realm. When that's shared as a public comment and that's publicized of, hey, here's kind of an alternative, you get all the same stuff, the same amount of parking spaces, the same building footprint. It's just we're sliding everything over 50 feet. And oh, by the way, the worst thing that's going to happen to this is that you yield out the potential for something better. That's the stuff that we can be advocating for, and a conversation that's happening in some city halls across the country, but not enough. And I think that's something that our local conversations and our membership can actually do. Fairly simple, very simple public comment. And changing and shifting that conversation in their communities.
Yeah, I love that. I find that so exciting. And one of the things that always challenges me is to say that this is part of the recreating or really reforming the craft of building places well. And that as we see, I think there is interest in, the craft of building, the craft of, fine construction, the craft of fine woodworking, other types of basic core skills that really help to contribute to making great places. And I think some of what you're saying there as well, like really begins to shift that as well. And I think one of the challenges that we have in a lot of our municipalities is that we will outsource the work of designing streets rather than retaining the skills and the ability and the memory of how to do that really well. And so the costs tend to get inflated because there's a fairly substantial review process that everything has to be run through, when the reality is there could have just been I don't want to oversimplify it. I think strong towns advocates, sometimes I speak mainly for myself, are at risk of simply being like, oh, it would just be so easy if we just did X. I won't want to recognize there is complexity here, but some of that complexity actually is broken down when you are able to enter into these places and say, what would be the next smallest thing that we could do? I really find that compelling and fascinating. The next question that I have for you is, while you were in the municipal government world, you had to receive, well, you're still in that world. Everyone is in that world. You had to receive project applications and take them through the gauntlet to get to the point where they could receive a building permit. We know that many projects are significantly altered because this process requires so many code requirements and things like that. What's a strong town's approach look like for site and building reviews? I had a city manager when I was speaking in Utah, and he said, hey, I mean, I understand that you want to remove some of the regulations, but you can't get rid of it all. It was sort of like an all or nothing sort of thing. And we're obviously not advocating for that. But what does a strong town's approach on this type of a challenge and a thorny issue look like?
Yeah, I think it's getting into the mindset of both the developer and the city. So there's two key principles that I think we have to keep in mind with that. One is to manage risk, and the other is to make the good easy. So the reason there are all the rules there is the city's trying to manage some sort of risk. I will tell you, talking to developers, when you get them out of City Hall and you get them at the bar or the coffee shop and you really talk to them about their projects, uh, they're not concerned about how thick your building code is and how thick your zoning code is. They're going to gripe about it. And there's going to be the one thing out there that they just are going to tell you that is the worst thing ever on earth. And you're the only jurisdiction that does it. But frankly, they don't care about that. They also don't care about what it costs to get a building permit in. If you notice in some of the most expensive cities in the world where the building permits and impact fees are ridiculous, they're still building there. Doesn't mean it's easier. It doesn't mean you shouldn't change that, but that's not their concern. What they're concerned about is risk. And the risk that they're dealing with is that first, they want to be sure that the staff they're dealing with are clear in the intent of the code. So I call it chutes and ladders, which is a common, we've all played that game. You roll the die and spin the wheel. And then sometimes you find kind of the easy way and you get the ladder and you go up and you jump a bunch of steps. And then all of a sudden you roll the dice and it's like, uh-oh, I didn't know I had to do parking, or uh-oh, I didn't know the stormwater was 2 inches of capture, not 1 inch of capture. And down the slide, I go back 12 steps. Developers don't like that. The more that you can get that out of the way to reduce risk, the more amenable they are to doing something different in the process. They also don't like it when planning commissions and cities change their minds and waffle and delay pieces. So next smallest thing you can do for anybody working in local government, the first thing you need to do is do an honest timeline of what it takes to get a project through. An honest timeline with that and an honest set of rules of what they need to abide by. You need to be clear with that initially, and it's okay for you to tell them that the project is going to be complex to get through. It's okay to tell a development team that this is that there's 55 steps to this. They just need to know that that's there, and you need to hold to your word. So if you've told them, put things in writing, do everything you need to do, but you need to follow through that process. And I built a lot of relationships with developers. We always had an understanding. I always thought it was important that we had an understanding of where this was at. And I could talk to them frankly about their projects, and they could talk to me frankly about what the obstacles were. So you have to be prepared to make some compromises. So when you make these sort of compromises, they always have to be based in the vision and intent you have within the development in your community. If it's people first, if it's walkability, if it's getting the cars behind the building, if it's narrow streets, whatever those pieces are, you need to be very clear and loud about that through the entire process. When you get to the process and the developer says, I'm stuck and I can't meet your parking code, I'm going to be short 4 parking spaces according to your parking code. Or, you told me I have to have 6 street trees. I can only get 4 in. Those are not critical path items for most municipalities on the vision of getting a project through. So be prepared to make those compromises. And I assure you, all of your codes have some sort of alternative compliance, and there's all different ways that can be documented and approved. So if you're clear on what the requirements are, you're frank with a discussion with the developers, and you lay out what that path is and prepared to compromise without compromising on your vision, you will get the projects moving. Notice I didn't say start with rewriting your code. Rewriting your code has a lot of risk. Get some development under your belt, get some developers on your team. And then as you're going through that process where you had to compromise because the parking code was too rigorous and they needed a variance or a waiver, or somebody needed to overlook that they were short 4 parking spaces, you use that to go back to revise that section of code. You do it after that fact. Again, changing it midstream, the developers, as much as they would like the code change, that's a risk, and you'll scare them midway through a project. So it's those little steps. So you want to once you get projects moving forward, once you get development moving forward, and when I say development, don't think that that's a new subdivision. It's the small entrepreneurial that wants to come downtown and be in that vacant building that's been vacant for 15 years. It's the food truck that wants to be able to come down on Tuesday nights and sell pizza or Greek food or hoagies. It's those are the things that are there. When it comes to the larger developments, upscale that. So if you have a development coming in and they want to do, affordable housing is something within what you need or you want, it's in your vision for your community. You should be working with them to figure out where the compromises are that support the vision, but don't get caught down in the weeds, and then use those things to untangle the codes afterwards. Last week, I wrote an article about a process I used in Martin County, Florida, where there are actually 4 layers of zoning code over one area. Completely just a mess. I mean, that's the nicest thing I can say to it. There were multiple times I attempted, and the department I worked in, the community, we attempted to rewrite the code. We attempted to change the code. It was not going to happen. We did not have the political will to do that. So by clarifying the steps of what actually applies to a site, and what I found in all the sites, once I kind of unlocked how to develop them, so here I am as a staffer, working within the system, identifying how to untangle and just organize the parts of the code. So it's not rewriting it, it's just writing the path. Of the 4 zoning codes, which is the code that applies here? And then I found fundamentally in every site, there were like 3 options, the easy, the medium, and the super hard. And you kind of pick those, and whatever development team, whatever property owner came in, some of them just wanted something they could get in quick and get out. It was permitted. It was part of the vision. It was going to meet all the design requirements. Here's the path to do it. Some were kind of adventurous. They wanted to go and kind of do something a little bit different, think crazy, fun things like mixed use or live work units, things that I think through the Strong Towns approach and through our membership we're familiar with, but these are still foreign objects out there in the world. So they wanted to do those. And then it was, the seasoned development team that is used to trucking through the system, and they're willing to wait 2 years to get an approval. They wanted to do a whole block at a time. Outlining each one of those so they knew what the complexities were, what all of the different aspects of it were. They could come in, wasn't designing the project for them. I was outlining a path to reduce their risk. I was untangling the code without rewriting the code. So we weren't changing any of the rules. They just knew which rules applied. And as a staff member, and I share this with anybody working in a planning department or on a development review team, outlining those pieces, that removes what's perceived by the developers as the gotcha moment. Halfway through the development or the very end, it's like, oh, staff found this decrepit piece of code that said we have to do something we never contemplated. It also got the staff reviewers on there in the position from a staff side, like, oh my God, I forgot to read chapter 6. I've done 3 reviews and I forgot about chapter 6. And in chapter 6, there's 6 things they needed to do. None of them were shown here. What do I do now? Outlining this didn't cost anything but my time. When we talk about economic development, it wasn't a multi-million-dollar piece. It was the couple hours a week I was investing on that work, which was in my job description. It was already being invested in my employment at that location. And that little bit, the little bit they paid me, unlocked millions of dollars of development. So it was kind of economic development by streaming that. So clarifying those pieces, one little step at a time. The next smallest thing, the smallest thing I could find is I'm going to figure out what's permitted on a piece of property. Once the developments came in, the next smallest thing as they came in, what were the things that were troublesome that could have gotten a better project if we got a rule out of the way? Or where were there 3 or 4 regulations about the same thing? Like In the sign code, why is there fence requirements? In the landscape code, why is there fencing requirements? And then here's this other chapter of fencing. So now I'm 3 different areas talking about fencing. What are the rules? I could outline that and tell you what those pieces are. I could go to the planning director and get a determination letter to which of those would apply to this site. And I could hand that to a property owner and say, okay, I can't change the code, but I've untangled it for you. That's the next smallest step that you can do. Once those are identified, just like drawing and moving a building on a site, once I outline and people realize fencing or signage is in 4 or 5 areas of code, somebody else will champion that change. So it's not just me. I'm going to find somebody else at this, either a developer, a private resident, or frankly, the planners get embarrassed that they forgot that this was in the code. And I would encourage you to leverage the orderly top-down approach with that, because all the planners want to have a very orderly approach. So as much as we say from Strong Towns, let's do chaotic but smart, that's the operation system I was working in, but the operators I was working with were the orderly folks. And I would just feed them what the orderly things they needed to do and guide them through that process. That's the next smallest step. So yeah, a lot of different things there, but this could apply to any planning department, any permitting department across the country that are reviewing these things. Again, very low risk, and it gets the developers moving.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And especially the way in which you outline, like, what does it take to untangle those knots? Because when the clock is ticking and that risk is accumulating, the dollars are going out the door. And the challenge can sometimes be that the only thing that we are able to see built in our communities are these large scale projects, because they're the only ones that can handle that amount of leveraged risk. In contrast, if you say there's a swift approach, which allows you to actually get your money out of the project quite quickly, and it's going to be modest, it's going to be narrow, it's going to be built to scale that's more human scale. I think a lot of construction companies would consider maybe we get into that field where we do 6 or 7 of these types of smaller sites rather than the one mega complex. The big builders we will always have with us, but we need to find ways to incentivize and really speed up the process in a lot of ways for others. I want to call in Stephen Jacques, is a planner in Athens, Georgia, as well as Clark County. And Stephen, do you want to just unmute yourself and maybe offer some thoughts on the question as well? I want to just give you an opportunity. What does the Strong Towns approach look like for site and building reviews, and more generally around things like this? Oh, did we lose Stephen? Oh, there he is. Good. I can't hear you, Stephen. And it says you're unmuted, so we've got technical difficulties here. I don't know if you have a different mic set up with headphones, that can always be tricky.
How's this?
It sounds okay. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Edward. I've been admiring your work ever since you joined Strong Towns here, so I appreciate that. And you have a lot more experience with local government than I do. I've only been in this position for about a year, so I won't add too much. I'll just share a little bit about our experience here in the Athens Clark County Planning Department. One of the things that predictability and just kind of knowing what's expected, even if it's a lot. We can talk about deregulation, and that doesn't necessarily mean that we just throw out all the rules and you can build whatever you want. Sometimes we have really important rules about, if we threw out all the rules, we'd probably still get the Taco John's drive-through. And if we want that to come to the street, we'd probably get a lot of pushback from certain folks in the developer community. But if that's really important to us, then we should have that in there. It just needs to be as clear and upfront as possible, and having defensible standards. There's always going to be the project that has some unique situation, or there's a little bit of interpretation in the wording of the code, and you might get pressed on, well, why are you requiring that? And I think we owe it to the people asking that question to have a good solid answer for why we're expecting that and how we interpret it, and doing that consistently. Because if you get into a situation where you don't really know your own standards very well, and you can't defend them very well, then you become sort of a custom. Every project becomes a custom negotiation, and that's not fair. It slows it down. It creates a lot of headaches for everybody. We try and front load the process here, so we've weighted a lot of our internal staffing resources towards the by right reviews. So when you come in and you just want to follow the rules, you don't need any exceptions. We call it by right, and we have set timelines on when you apply by this date, you have X amount of days, and we'll get you a response. Then it's usually a week or two, depending on what you're doing, and we try our best to abide by that. So if you're going to promise that, then abide by it. But that also adds predictability and fairness to the process. And then in conversations when we have folks who are thinking about doing a project, or they're in the middle of something and they have a problem, they're trying to figure out how to comply with something. A lot of times when we have to say no, it's not that we owe them a path to compliance, to doing whatever it is they want to do, but we do try and say no, but here are your options. Here's how you might think about working to get to this state of compliance so you can get your permit. That's pretty much it from my end. So.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much, Stephen. Really appreciate that. Then let's go on to what looks like it actually, oh wait, let me make sure. I was just going to drop in. I love that reference to allowing the next increment of development by right, or Stephen wasn't specifically highlighting allowing the next increment, but that's a core Strong Towns principle, that we need to allow the next increment of development by right, that every generation or every decade, really, there should be sort of a gradual emergence of the next stage of development within a neighborhood, so that way, and it should be done by right, where you walk in and you can walk right back out, because the thing that you're asking for is already virtually approved. But I want to bring Edward back to ask you this question: what changes can we take when we take as a starting point the Strong Towns principles, that land is a scarce resource that we must use carefully in order to build strong communities? How does that change the way that we approach the question of what we're doing with that land, and how effectively we're being stewards of it?
Yeah, I think we need to be prepared to look at what the maximum development potential is for properties. And so when we think about this, it shouldn't just be a new infill development, but it also, when we are doing public infrastructure projects, roadway projects, when we're doing park projects, the land that we have is scarce. And it actually is as a municipality, as a corporation, it is the thing that the municipality can share with someone to build wealth. So this, as a municipality, you're almost as, and I would try to work with a lot of my municipalities to talk about, and elected officials, to get them to be thinking about the city operating as a development corporation, not just a corporation. So I'm sitting in the trenches with economic development and building and planning and zoning, getting the elected officials to think about themselves as a developer. And I learned this watching the master plan developers across the country, where they take one piece of land and they subdivide it into smaller pieces, and then they shop it. And there's a lot of nasty things you can have developed. I mean, there are things that are specifically in industrial districts, and there are things that, like adult businesses and all that, those can come in. Those are viable developments because they get built, but they take away value from the property. Also, a lot of developers on the private side, they're not just going to give out the biggest chunk of land or the most premier locations in the city for just anything. If somebody wants to come in and build a parking lot or a self-storage facility, it's not going to be on the most premier site, and it's not going to generate the excitement of other development. So if you think about a developer when we always talk about the next smallest step, and when you think about the city as a developer, and then you think about the next smallest step, what are the things the city can do for that resource? And there's actually two parts to this. So let's first talk about new development. When new development comes in, the very first thing the city should do is evaluate the property, not just on the vision for the site. Is it 1 story, 2 stories? Does it have affordable housing, a mix of uses? Are they providing a pocket park? All those pieces, doing those. But on the fiscal model, the analysis, will that development generate more or less than what we have in our core? So if you're going to build a new development, and time again in communities we work with, that new development is less productive. The shiny and new, meaning all the building codes, meaning all the current standards, is less productive than what you have within your urban core. It's the Taco John's analysis. I just did the analysis of one of our cows where a vacant lot in that area of the downtown core is 3 times more productive than a brand new single family house, same size lot in the same municipality. The vacant lot is 3 times more productive than the brand new house. It doesn't take into all the expenses and values in it. So that's for new. For infill and redevelopment, thinking about that in the flexibility of those areas. If the building has been vacant for more than 6 months, many cases you have vacant properties and your community has been vacant for 5-10 years. What's holding that up? As a developer, as a city, trying to figure out what needs to be untangled for that site to seek a new life where somebody can come in and build there. And again, we're working with communities through our community action lab, that well-intentioned communities, probably some of the brightest staff I've ever met in cities. They're working hard in these places. And the first approach is to add on a very heavy blanket of government help. At Strongtown's approach is, when we talk about the next smallest step, what are the things that we can allow folks to do in those buildings with the least amount of kind of oversight? And even more than just by right, what is the least amount of touch we can do there? If it's something we want in the community, it was the vision. How much compromise can we get? How many different sort of rules that don't really apply to that mission of getting somebody in there can we set aside to get them in? I mean, my town right now is struggling with food trucks. There's a big battle about food trucks coming to our little main street. The local businesses don't want it, but I will tell you, in all the research and analysis, food trucks drive people to a location, and there's no way a food truck can outperform a restaurant brick and mortar. But it's an unknown piece. And I assure you, in my downtown, after 6 o'clock at night, it's a pretty quiet place. So having activity down there would bring people in. It's a beneficial thing. So we just need to make sure that, as you're working through this Strong Towns report approach, thinking about the municipality not as a regulator of land, not as a arbitrator of rules, but what are those things that you can do to increase value in your community to encourage this investment? Whether it's something small that somebody wants to do a remodel to their house, to something more, something a little bit larger where they want to fill in that empty block that's been vacant, it's been a parking lot or empty field for the last 20 or 30 years. What are the things that we can do to encourage that, to move that forward? Thinking as a developer, not as a regulator. And that's a big shift out there. And, trying to work through those with your community to think about a developer. We talk about little risks. What is the risk of somebody coming in and building a 1-story building on that vacant lot in the downtown area that's been vacant for all this time? And we have to question ourselves, if we want that, why is it the same development review, entitlement, and regulatory process for that as it is for building something like the dollar store 10 miles out of town? And we've got to kind of work through that internally from a development perspective, because our land is our most precious resource. And for our cities really to be prosperous, we need to allow for that thickening and reinvestment in those areas, because we know that those urban cores and downtown areas and centers of traditional development pattern outperform anything else we're building today. And how do we get more of that? And having that mindset, well, we want more of that, is what we've got to put forward when we're working in our communities.
I think that's fantastic, Edward. And I think that's also a great place for us to begin to wrap up. Thank you so much for just entertaining those questions and giving thought to it in advance, but also an encouragement for those that are watching is to check out Ed's column every week. It comes out on Friday mornings, and it's been a great source of just new ideas, fresh takes on familiar themes that we've touched on. One of my favorites is Ed's piece on the Taco John's 2.0. If anyone's followed the Strong Towns Curbside Chat, you become familiar and are introduced to the idea of the Taco John's development in the city of Brainerd, and the way in which an old blighted block that was identical to another block that was just up the street from it was torn down in order to get the latest, newest creation, a drive-through of Norwegian Mexican food that, as Chuck calls it in Brainerd. And the consequence was that at the moment that it was constructed, it was only paying almost half, or it was only worth half the amount of value that the old blighted block that had stood for ages was continuing to hold its value, continued to contribute property taxes and sales taxes and things like that. And so what Ed did, just by just saying, how could this site be used in a more suitable way, I think sets a great sequence of thoughts and ideas in motion. And I think that that's core to helping us move ahead in terms of the Strong Towns movement. So thanks, everybody. I have posted a couple of housekeeping notes there that our next batch of office hours, there's 4 scheduled over the next 5 weeks. The end of the month will be with Chuck on Strong Cities. I'm calling the session Strong Cities, but it's a parallel to what we did with lessons for small communities. This will be lessons for large communities, large cities, big city problems, that sort of stuff. I suspect we'll talk a bit about transit during that time, housing, and other pieces like that. So if you have questions, or even if you have just general questions, one of the things I realized is that the registration link in this past batch of 5 didn't actually give much of a clear prompt for where you could insert questions or even topics that you wanted to cover. If you have a moment when you go through the registration process again, and if you're wondering, why are we having to do this again? The reason is last time, the general consensus was that it worked fairly well. It does put it on your calendar for 5 weeks in a row. It does give you an indication, oh, what's coming up. So that way you're not always having to search for the latest link, things like that. If ever you feel strongly that we need to change that process, do let me know. We want this to be a useful time and certainly make it worth your while as well. And so that's coming up. Next week is Daniel Harrigus on unleashing the swarm of small-scale development and really addressing the challenge that often comes to Strong Towns, which is if we are committed to incrementally improving our communities, incrementally investing in our places, one, is that fast enough? 2, does that respond to the real pressing challenges that we have around us? And 3, does that scale up? And Daniel has some great insights on that. He'll speak as a convert. He said previously he didn't actually think that was a key part of the Strong Towns approach. And as he grew in understanding it and came to really see that how it worked, he realized, no, this is essential to what we're doing within the context of Strong Towns. So hopefully that's a bit of a teaser for you. Again, if you need to step away, really thank you for being here. But for the others, if you want to spend some time afterwards, we can continue the conversation on the theme or branch out into other topics as well and enjoy the after party together. But thank you so much. And I hope that you all have a wonderful day.